mother, about 35 or so, I finished the Giant Joshua one Christmas Eve. And it was the biggest read of my entire life. It hit me stronger than anything since has ever hit me because it was like my people. And I knew I kept having to remind myself it was a novel. And anyway, I was so overwhelmed with that piece of literature. There for several reasons. Another reason that I was so taken with it was her use of the symbolism of the Great Smile, which later on was such a disappointment to find that some critics didn't like her use of this so-called mysticism. But probably Carol Lynn's husband knew exactly where she was coming from. And
Yeah.
so did I because of certain experience that I had. And it was the only book I had found, and believe me, I had looked and looked and looked for some confirmation of the experience I had. But when Maurine used that symbolism of the Great Smile, it was so right on with what I had felt that that I was so grateful for that book to come along and sort of like validate what I had felt. So we had that in common. And I never did find out exactly what experience she herself might have had, but I know she had probably many little liftings of that veil because she had that deep affiliation with the atmosphere down there. And you've got to be a little bit, have some of that Dixie dust under your fingernails that is always there to maybe understand why that dry old country, it's so enticing. And it does have the vistas and the naked rocks. There's something about that. And you get just the right atmosphere in the, like she so wonderfully explained in so many places. And every time she would hit that, I knew exactly where she was coming from. Even though I wasn't raised in St. George, my grandmother lived there. And my people, like I say, from the, oh, I don't know how many lines of my people were the ones that did the settling and did the living on the out the Lutheran Greens and the whole bit that they went through. Anyway, talking about my experience with her, my husband and I, Glenn Hale, we had just retired and we retired quite young in our late 50s. And so we were just looking for a new world to live in. And we started out with our trailer, our fifth, our Airstream, and we were going to do the bit that most lucky retirees do. And we get about 100 miles from home and just about kill ourselves because my husband, I'm sure, was going too fast, but the trailer started to jackknife and just about tipped us all over. But it did not completely turn over because those Airstreams are made rather good. And so we limped on to St. George, and the trailer was totaled as far as the insurance company said. So we settled there in St. George thinking, what else will we do? So anyway, I wanted to do art. That's something I've been waiting all my life to have a chance. And my husband said, okay, you followed me around. Now it's your turn. You can do what you want. So I'd signed up for some art classes. But before this time, I'd been in the fringes of the Sunstone and Dialogue world. And Marilyn Brown and I had become friends. She was the one that wanted to write the biography of Maurine Whipple. And it was Eugene England and Craycroft that said, oh, somebody needs to do that. Someone, she's still alive, somebody needs to do that. And Marilyn said, okay. So she came down and because I have all of these relatives that I had easy access to a lot of information. And my grandmother, like I said, had lived there and she had a very good reputation in the city. And it seemed like anything that I wanted, I'd just have to mention her name and the doors were open. So I said, well, I think I can find out where she is. And I did. And I made arrangements to go visit her with Marilyn and I. And I'll never forget that first visit. Let's see, Maurine would have been about 87. This was 1990. And she was in the rest home. And she was looked rather frail, but when she got talking, believe me, she sat up on that bed and she had more stamina than we did as far as talking. She was very, I could almost tell that she was telling stories that were almost remote. Like she told them so many times, but we were fascinated. And the way she told them, they were just like plots for a great novel, which they were. And so anyway, Marilyn's life changed and things happened, and she just was unable to get down there and do the work. And so, Veda, you've got to do it. Well, I didn't know how to write a biography, but with her encouragement, and particularly Eugene England, I'll give him a lot of credit because I admired him so, and I would have done anything he'd asked me to do. But I was just the one that seemed to be shuffled into the position. And then another person I think that I wish was on this panel, because Lavina Fielding Anderson was also a person who recognized that this job needed to be done. And she knew it was a valuable piece to add to our Mormon literature history, and again, here I was without a heck of a lot of experience in writing. Yeah, I'd tried to write a few novels, but Lavina had helped me and was encouraging. But anyway, with those people, and I'm sure if I thought that Carol Lynn would have been involved in that, I'd have been doing whatever they asked me to do because I admired these people so. But coming from Panguitch, I didn't have much clout in the world. Anyway, when Marilyn's life turned the turns it did, it came down to me. So I started gathering information. I thought I could at least be the gatherer of this information. And things happened, and Lavina I knew that I could lean on Lavina's doctor's degree and her great reputation to keep me out of trouble. And she was so anxious to have it done, bless her heart, that she was willing to give her time, and she should have been given a much more attention with the biography, because she was there to teach me how to write a biography and to keep me digging up the right kinds of information and how to document it. She gets the credit, but then her life took a turn. I guess she was one of the September 6, and what a story that is. It seemed like everybody that touched Maurine had bigger stories happening in their life, like Carol Lynn said, that it just was almost unusual circumstance to be thrown into a situation where Maurine was concerned. It seems like there was just drama wherever she touched. Anyway, so I got busy and just started to collect all the information I could. I did figure that was the first thing you had to do. And then I got up into the archives at BYU, and I realized that all of this information that Maurine had, all of her papers, were up there in these 42 boxes, just strung together. Nothing was coherent. There was papers like advertisements for pantyhose amid all of these old manuscripts, and the whole collection was waiting for it to be archived, and BYU was busy and kept putting it off. And I had another relative up there in the library that the minute I said I was a Hale and we put that together, she let me into the archives and said, well, do what you can with it. And so again, not knowing what I was doing, I was the one that got into the archives or these boxes, started trying to put something together that I just did it chronologically. That's all I knew how to do. And then I realized that this, as a biography, I probably had a very, very unique opportunity, because how many other biographers have a chance to go through someone's papers that haven't been gone through by that person themselves to take out all of the embarrassing things? But Maurine was a keeper, and she'd kept letters that, or that anyone else would have destroyed, and she would have destroyed had she known they were up there. In fact, when I would bring them down a few pages at a time and put them in front of her and try to get her to tell me more about them, sometimes she would get so angry she'd want to throw me right out of their room, and she would call up her caregiver, Carol Jensen, which is another great story, and say, come on, we've got to get up there. I have no right to those letters. And she'd want to get up there and go through her papers. And I always felt a little guilty and sorry for Maurine to have her life opened up like that, because a lot of it was embarrassing. She had a lot of romances that she would just pour her heart out, and you're going through these letters, just think, oh, Maurine, no, please, no more. Because any man would just be ready to run to be fed the kind of neediness that she had. And then you would, as a woman, you were just hurt for her, because if she had had a good, strong man in her life, she could have been our Mormon Margaret Mitchell, and we could have had our Gone with the Wind, which we do have. That's what I always compared it with. We have our Mormon Gone with the Wind, because both Maurine and Margaret Mitchell were one-time book authors. They poured their whole life and family history into one great piece of literature. And there were so many similarities. I won't go into them now, but anyway, Margaret Mitchell had some strong men to help shield her from the hardships of life. Maurine had her father that did a lot of shielding, but the rancor that existed between those two and the reasons for it, I don't know if I ever got clear to the bottom of. I'm sure I didn't, but anyway, it was not an easy time of life for a woman who was so far on the feminine scale, and yet without what a good, strong man brings to the feminine side of life. She did the best she could, but she was always so vulnerable to that call to find her heart's, the kind of love that a true woman really craves. And she just didn't come, and the years went by. So in my opinion, that's why we don't have the sequel in a finished form. Anyway, let's see. I had 2 years with her, and I would meet with her almost every day. And it was pretty intense sometimes, because sometimes she hated me and sometimes she loved me, and sometimes I didn't know if I'd be back the next day, because what I did was I'd bring these letters and things down from BYU to ask her about them, try to get them some verification so I could put it all into perspective. And sometimes she would cooperate, and sometimes she just wouldn't remember. So it was an interesting, touchy job, and I often felt like I was probing where no other human being would have the right to probe into another's life. And that's why I did, in several cases in the biography, we used a false name for some of the men that she was involved with, because it just didn't seem right to take someone's personal life and spread it out the way you could have done. Anyway, I don't know whether I did it the right way or the wrong way. And Lavina was, she was as perplexed as I was most of the time. And she wanted me to do it in topics, and I was quite intent on doing it chronologically. It just made sense to me. Anyway, took me 20, some odd years to finish it, and I never did. Well, I did it sort of. I put it around with my art where I really wanted to do. Then when Labina, I just kept waiting for Labina to have time to do her polishing and to read the manuscript that I'd send her. And so it would drag on and drag on. So towards the last, I did do my art. And I did open a gallery in Panguitch and had a good 10 years of getting to pretend like I was an artist at least. I had a good experience there. And my husband was such a good supporter. He would drive me places and help me, and he never complained. And I was so grateful that just before he died, a few weeks before he died, we get the letter telling me that the book had won the prize for the 2011 Mormon History biography of that year. And so it was finally published, even though it got turned down by University of Utah Press, probably because I sent them these two great big old, the whole thing, all I had done, everything I'd done, I just did it chronologically and sent them the whole shebang. And I guess it was so overwhelming that they didn't know what to do with it. So I tried to cut it myself, and finally Craig Crawford, it was just starting out his publishing company, and I think he, and I still believe, and Labina's never fessed up to it, but I think she, with her connections, must have talked to people and said, hey, this is an important piece of Mormon literature that we need to preserve, and whatever. I don't know all the insides. I was so sick of it by then and knew that I needed to do my own life because I have family that I need to pay attention to. So anyway, the book was finally published and I went on with my life, and I'm grateful I did it, even though I knew that there would never be any monetary value to the work that I did, but it was that love and desire to help Mormon literature have a piece of the past that I felt was very, very important. And I do believe it is important. And I think that later on, there will be more and more people look at it when they wonder, well, I wonder how it was like for a single woman in the Depression. I wonder how it was like for those people that their grandparents were polygamous. What was it really? What was the fallout of all that? So I think as the time goes along, that and particularly with this new book, and thank goodness that Lynn and
Andrew
had taken up, because as I went along, Labine and I both knew that all of this unpublished work was important. So as we went through all this stuff, we kind of went ahead and did the work on the unpublished works, knowing that it would be important. And we just sort of set it aside. And then after about 20 years and our lives had taken these different turns, neither one of us had the stamina to go on and push through a book of the unpublished works. So I'm very grateful that Lynn, and by the way, Lynn was the way we met was she's the only one that read my biography and looked me up because she liked it. And so I realized that she had all these credentials that I didn't have, and I was worn out. I'm an old lady, and my husband had died, and I was closing out my gallery, going on to my old age time of life. I'm so grateful that she picked up the gauntlet and is carrying us through. So I guess that's what my little part. Is that enough?
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you were able to spend that time with Maurine and get all that down and create the biography. Those of you who've read the book recently, I really encourage you to read the biography that Veda wrote. And as she mentioned, it was won the best biography from the Mormon Historical Association that year. It's a beautiful work. It's such a sad work in so many ways because Maurine had this great triumph, but then she had a lot of years of sadness before and afterwards. And it's a little painful to get through some of that stuff. And like you said, these letters that she wrote that sometimes were so painful, but then also so beautiful. I mean, she has such a great voice. She has this great kind of mid-century witty, style about her that, when you read the magazines at the time, I think she kind of learned from the kind of witty magazines and novels at the time. But just really great voice that she has. And we have it in our literature, but also in her letters. And I'm really glad that you're able to get so many of those letters into the biography. Also, let me just mention that, about her loneliness there in St. George and connect. Another big story that someday I'm going to write down is her relationship with Juanita Brooks. Juanita was one of her teachers when she was in high school. Juanita was a young teacher there in St. George. And they got to be friends and colleagues. And they were working together on these various documents of St. George history, and they'd share with each other. But they also clashed a lot. Their personalities were very different. And as we've seen, Maurine could be very needy. And it's a very interesting history between them. And it seemed like you look at the records, there's not much after, say, about 1960. But I found one lovely letter in the Juanita's papers from Maurine, right after Maurine's father, Charlie, had died. And she thanked Juanita for her kind words. Apparently, she sent her a letter after her father's death. And she included in it and she said, "Oh, you've always been a rock to me." And she included a poem from her father, Charlie. And that's the only time I've ever seen a poem by Maurine's father. And it's actually a great poem. So I'm gonna have to publish that sometime. Anyways, thank you thank you so much for all the great work you did. And you mentioned Lavina. So Lavina had been sitting on this, work that Veda and Lavina had done together on the unpublished works, on the sequel and all these other great articles and stories that she had written. And I met Lavina a couple of years ago when the Association for Mormon Letters gave her a Lifetime Award. And she said, "I have this work on this disc and I just can't do it. But a lot of it's done. Can you find someone who could take this on?" And so I ended up taking it on and brought Lynn in. And so with Lynn and Veda together, the three of us completed this manuscript. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But I'm so thankful for Lavina for putting us together and restarting that effort that Veda started. Okay, we want to get to people's questions, but I definitely want to hear from Curtis Taylor. Curtis didn't spend quite as much time, perhaps, as the others with Maurine, but he did spend a very interesting few days with her, and so I'd like to hear his take on Maurine and his experiences, and perhaps the book or anything that you'd like to say. So, Curtis Taylor, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This has brought back a lot of memories. I appreciate your reaching out to me and letting me know that you guys were doing all of this. I wasn't aware of most of this going on. I read her book in the late 80s, in the late 80s. And so I was a young man. I was in my early 30s. She was in her 80s. And when I finished the book, it was a very powerful experience for me. And somewhat out of character, I had a tremendous desire to go meet her, to go just visit with her. I was very poor at the time. We had, my wife and I think 3 kids at the time. And I was delivering pizzas for Domino's Pizza because I was writing my first novel. And I somehow gathered enough money to go down to St. George. I found out, I believe, from Eugene, England, where she lived and so on. Well, I took this little tape recorder with me. And I recorded about 10 hours of my interviews with her. I had forgotten until just the other day. I was going through them again and found out that I had received a letter from Harold B. Lee Library telling me that those are archived now in the, I guess, special collections, or the special collections at that time. Well, I was really taken by the things that she told me about the hardships she had gone through. That's not in the book, obviously, and so I didn't know any of that before I met her. And I'd like to share just a couple of things that she told me. Some of this may not be new, and some of it may be. She, of course, talked about her bishop. She actually told me several times he was a very good man. And then she would say, but he gave me hell. And then she talked about her stake president, who was concerned because she was such a distraction in the area after the book came out, that he came up with this perfect solution to send her out on a mission. And her father told her not to go. Of course, her father wasn't active anyway, but her father told her not to go, and she finally decided that she would not go as things were happening. She said she just didn't have the desire to go represent the church at that time. She talked about this one moment, and I'm going to read this to you from her words. She said, first she went to the University of Utah to give a talk there. This is not too long after the book had come out. And she was asked to go down and visit with J. Reuben Clark, who was in the first presidency. And she said, he just plowed into me. He told me that I was a disgrace to the Mormons. He said, if I had my way, I'd see that you were excommunicated from the church. Well, obviously, Maurine was stunned. He went on to say, goes on to say that he told me that only a woman who gives up her religion and everything she cares for could write a book like that. He also said, I think Satan's got a hold of you. Now, to hear that from a friend would be hard. From a family member would be hard. To hear that from the member of the first presidency that you've been raised to respect, it was devastating. And she went on and talked about that. She said, I got to the stage where I couldn't go out in public without crying. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I lost weight. The reaction was just too much to take. Some of her experiences with Harold B. Lee and some of the others. He actually told her, according to her, and she said this 3 different times in my interviews, he told her, you can't expect any of these people to like you after what you've done. Well, anybody who's read the book knows that what she did was something wonderful, at least in our minds today. I know that people at that time were very sensitive about polygamy, and we have to give them latitude for their time and place as well. But she said that, and she didn't really say this, she intimated it, that the thing that hurt her the most was her parents' reaction to the book. Her father had given her $2,000 to help write the book, to support her to write it. He'd built a little office for her, which wasn't very good. She said she almost froze to death in that office. But that she could hardly talk about that, her parents' reaction to it. But then 88-year-old Aunt Sadie Miles came to her one day, or asked her to come over. And this is what she had to say. This is from Maurine's interview with me. Oh, dear girl, you have spoken for your people. It is a great piece of writing, and I can't leave it alone. God is with you. Now, that was one of the women who was one of the composite figures in the book. She knew that what Maurine had written was basically true. So, of course, a lot of this has been documented, but I did want to put her own, or this perspective onto it, what she was telling me those days there. She said that her one great friend high up in the church was George Albert Smith. And if you know anything about him, he was known for his great charity, his great love. I mean, this is a man who, when he was a prophet, would pick up strangers on the street corner who looked like they were homeless during the Depression, and he would take them home and eat dinner with them and let them wash their clothes and take a shower. And he would do that 4 or 5 times a week. George Albert Smith. Well, she said, after finding out what she had done with her book and so forth, he said to her, quote, "May God be with you. You're doing a wonderful thing for the church." And then he invited her to carry on a correspondence with him, which she did. And it's not surprising that later she said of him, George Albert Smith is the one who really, really was nice to me. I just loved him. So just a couple more quotes here. Have you heard what Bernard DeVoto said to her about wishing he could write like she did? One of the great literary critics of the day, Harvard University, he said that he wished, or that he would be willing to give 10 years of his life if he could write like this 30-something-year-old woman. That meant a lot to her, and she kept on a long correspondence with him. Well, after everything was done, after looking at all this, I also have a lot of notes on how she wrote, longhand, of course, on these end pieces from the local newspaper, and I've got copies of those. I'm sure Veda has a lot of that stuff too. I came away with, from those 3 days with her, I came away with a couple of very strong impressions. One was I had been in the presence of a major literary talent. Even in her 80s, the way she spoke and the way she listened was just deep, and you could tell that she was sensitive, but that she had overcome a lot and she had suffered a lot. And then at one point she said that she had lost her youth to the giant Joshua. She had sacrificed her youth to the giant Joshua. She would never get it back, and she had lost her confidence to be able to write again for a full-length book. I became sick, physically ill, thinking about what we had lost because of those who, for whatever reason, had been so hard on her that she had been crushed. Her confidence had been crushed. Now, one more thing. During one of those days, we sat outside the St. George Temple for about 3 hours in my car. It was January, kind of cold. We sat up there, and this is a temple that her grandfather had helped build and then was the president of. And remember, he was with Wilford Woodruff, and Wilford Woodruff was baptized for the founders of the nation. And McAllister, her grandfather himself, had been baptized by the president for about 50 of those people, including George Washington. This is a man, well, it was a family that was well respected at that time. But then I asked her how long it had been since she'd been in that temple. And she said she had to think about it, probably not since she was a teenager when she did baptisms for the dead. And again, I didn't know her that well, so that surprised me a little bit. And as we talked about it, I found myself feeling strongly to encourage her to go back. And it was surprising me. This was all a little bit out of character for me. First of all, I didn't like to travel much, and there I was 1,000 miles away from my home and living on money that was hard to come by, and as I was writing my own book. And now I'm encouraging her strongly to go back to the temple. And over the years, that's probably the main thing I remembered about those 3 days, is the way how she changed in those conversations to then telling me how much she wanted to go back. And she began sharing her testimony with me. And she talked about how it had been dormant all these years, but somehow the fire was still there. She believed it, and she loved her people. She said, "I love the Mormons because wherever they go, they make things beautiful." That was a quote from her. And then I found out a couple of years later that she had gone through the temple. And I guess when she went through the veil, she was weeping tears. And then about a year after that, she was gone. And I've wondered, and I'll just share this with you as co-travelers here along the literary path, I've wondered if maybe her grandfather and a couple of others weren't pushing me to push her to come back home. So those are my recollections of Maurine Whipple.
Thank you very much, Chris. That's great. And if you could, in Veda's biography, there's a great description of her when she went to the temple, and she went with Carol Jensen's granddaughter, and her granddaughter includes there's a letter from her about the experience of being in the temple with her and seeing the picture of her grandfather in the temple. There's a big portrait of him in there and all of that. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Let's go ahead. Lynn and I, there's a couple other people I'd like to speak, but I want to open up to questions for anybody who's been reading the novel or has read the novel in the past. For us who have been reading it carefully, for Veda, the biographer, and for anyone here. Is there any questions or comments that anyone would like to unmute themselves and say?
Well, I want to thank those of you who've done this great work. Veda and I had talked years ago. Veda's probably been 20 years ago now, since we talked about publishing it. I had a little publishing company at the time called Aspen Books and Gold Leaf Press. Then I got kind of carried away with a big seller we had. And then I got very sick afterwards. But I had always wanted to do this work. I'd always wanted to publish this biography of Maurine, which wasn't done yet at that time. And then I got very sick with Lyme disease, was misdiagnosed, and I was just out of things for many years. I want to thank you and express my gratitude for this hard work, which you folks did. And without Veda being with her all those days and weeks and months toward the end of her life, this story wouldn't have been available to us. So thank you, Veda, and thank you to all of you, Andrew, and the rest of you, Lynn, who have made this happen.
Okay, well, so I'll open, thank you very much. So if the chat is open, if you'd like to write your question there, you could, or any kind of comment. And maybe we'll wait. If anybody has anything right now, go ahead. And if not, I'll go on to some other things we're planning. All right, well, if not, again, you can do it in the chat. Here, let me show you the table of contents for the upcoming book, A Craving for Beauty, The Lost Works of Maurine Whipple, edited by Veda, myself, and Lynn. And I'm gonna have Lynn introduce herself in a minute. So this is the material that Veda and Lavina had from the BYU archives, and also from other things that they had found, that Veda had found and worked with Maurine. A lot of the stuff Veda went over with Maurine. She showed it to her, and they looked at it together. A couple of the cases, there was like sections, a page missing or a rip in the paper, and Veda and Maurine together looked at it, and Maurine corrected it and added the things that would have been there. And so we have her comments in the introductions to a lot of these stories. Most of these are previously unpublished stories and essays. The first section is, so let me say, this book is going to be published by BCC Press soon, sometime probably early next year, hopefully in conjunction with a republication, at least in ebook form, of the Giant Joshua. But so it's got a first section of personal sketches, autobiographical sketches, the Confessions of a She-Devil that she wrote right before the Giant Joshua, which is about her own life. A sketch of her grandmother that is one of the models for Chloe in the Giant Joshua. The Maturing Artist, there's several stories, two of which have been published before, A Dress for Christmas. Where's the other one? Oh, and then, and The Lord Giveth. Those are the two that have been published in Dialogue and Sunstone towards the end of Maurine's life.
Christmas, we also published in our anthology about 20 years ago called Christmas for the World, along with stories by Orson Scott Card and many others in the church. Great story. That's
right, I'm sorry. Yes, Curtis facilitated the publication of A Dress for Christmas in that great, wonderful collection, Christmas for the World. That was the first thing by Maurine I'd ever read when I got that book, when it came out. But it was a story that she'd written in the 1940s. And so, they republished it there. The third story there in the Maturing Artist, Quicksand, that is a story that she wrote as a short story and was published in the University of Utah student journal. And it's a very good story about a very hardscrabble oil town on the kind of Nevada, Arizona, Utah border. And it's a good story. And then she expanded it into a novella called Beaver Creek Dam. And that was the novella that she sent in to for the Rocky Mountain Conference, Writers Conference, that she got accepted to. And that's where she was discovered by the literary people there that got her in touch with Hutton Mifflin and published The Giant Joshua. We don't have the novella. There's synopses of it, but the actual novella that she sent in is not in her papers, unfortunately. But we do have the original short story that it was based on, Quicksand. there's some narratives of faith, some very interesting, some of them more conventionally Mormon, some of them less conventionally Mormon. Mormon Saga, the first one, is she wrote very early on, probably in college, about Nauvoo, about a young couple that in some ways are similar to Chloe and Abijah, but in some ways different, who are in Nauvoo and have these terrible sufferings, and eventually the wife dies of childbirth, kind of like Willie in the Giant Joshua, and the husband decides that he needs to show his faith and not call a doctor and just believe in the blessings, and that's going to be published in Dialogue coming up pretty soon. I believe in the next issue this fall, so look forward to that. The wartime lecture, which I mentioned, which is a really great insight on her feelings about politics and feminism and pacifism, are all part of that wartime lecture, A Search for a Soul wartime lecture. So that's a really key piece, I think, for understanding her. The magazine articles, some of these were published, like Why I Have 5 Wives and Arizona Strip and Anybody's Gold Mine, and a couple of them are unpublished ones that she tried to get published but failed. This is the time when she maybe should have been writing the sequel, but instead turned to what she saw as a more lucrative opportunity in writing magazine articles for Saturday Evening Post and Life and Collier's. And then finally, the unfinished novels. Cleave the Wood is the sequel to The Giant Joshua, and there's 5 very long chapters. It's a very substantial part of the novel, and a very long synopsis that she wrote. So we have the whole story of Cleave the Wood. We understand where she was going to go with it. The first section is a very male section. If The Giant Joshua is kind of told from certainly there are men and women characters in it, but it's certainly a domestic and told from the point of view of the women in St. George. The Arizona Strip Cleave the Wood is about Chloe and Abijah's son, Jimmy, and he goes out to be a cowboy in the Arizona Strip. And it's him and his friends who represent kind of different attitudes towards Mormonism. One friend who's very cynical toward Mormonism, although he loves his pioneer heritage. And then another friend who's kind of a philosopher and somewhat of a mystic, and he loves religion and loves the Latter-day Saints religion. And these 3, and then Jimmy, who's kind of a cowboy and really is not interested in religion at all, and their lives out on the Arizona Strip. And so it's a very kind of male-focused story. And then there's he has a love interest, and there's a non-Mormon man who's kind of a cad, but he's very interesting, very dynamic character. And both Jimmy and this other man are vying for this girl's attention. And eventually Jimmy marries this girl, and anyways, there's the whole long story. And then there's he has a daughter, and who would be Maurine's age. She represents St. George of Maurine's generation, growing up in the very early part of the century. And she loves music. Music is something that really ties this novel together. We see Chloe singing the beginning of Giant Joshua, and as she's going down to St. George, and singing and music is such a big part of her life. And even in the worst times, she finds joy. And that's when she connects with her husband the most, is when they're singing together. Jimmy loves to sing as well, and he falls in love with this girl because they're together singing in this musical together, a community musical that's put on. And then the third character, Lindsay, Chloe's granddaughter, becomes a professional singer. She's a great singer. The St. George community loves her, and they even though her father has left the church at that point and kind of represents Maurine's father, who also had left the church. But this daughter is raised in St. George at the beginning of the century, and she loves music, and the community loves her, and they pay for her to go to the East to study music professionally. And she has these experiences there. And then at the end, as her father's dying, she comes back to St. George and sings at his funeral, sings Come, Come Ye Saints in the St. George Tabernacle. And there's a whole question about whether she'll rejoin her community, whether she'll rejoin her faith or not, is part of that. And so there's kind of a feminine first part in the Giant Joshua, and then this kind of male middle part of Jimmy and the Cowboys, and then perhaps a more feminine ending with the granddaughter, and with, again, music playing something throughout. Also, another unfinished novel, The Arizona Strip, which is she'd also wrote in the late 1940s about based on a true story that she probably heard from Juanita Brooks, because it was a kind of a Bonnie and Clyde couple who were robbing banks and other things in the St. George area, and then running down to the Arizona Strip and hiding there. And Juanita's husband, who was the sheriff in St. George, eventually arrested. The man was killed, and well, he shot and killed the man, and then he arrested the wife after this very difficult. Anyways, it's a great adventure story. A lot of it's there. It wasn't quite finished, but there is a synopsis of the whole novel, pretty detailed synopsis. So it's a very fun, interesting story. Again, St. George, not so much religion in this one, but certainly a lot of what it's like to be a woman, and various interesting female characters, some desperate characters in St. George. So it's a great adventure kind of Western novel. Okay, so stop that. Do we have any questions in the chat while I was doing that? Okay, looks like there's some questions. Let me just ask before I look at those and read those. I see Sherry Silver is here. Sherry, did you know Maurine at all? Did you? It seems like that I'd heard that you had. Or can you hear me? Or can you unmute? If not, that's okay. Okay, how about, okay, I should have somebody here reading this while I'm doing this.
Good. I can speak now.
sure.
I didn't
Okay.
know her, but she certainly was an influence. Her book and style set a pattern, set a standard that everyone wanted to measure his or her work against. So I think we've all appreciated Maurine's life and accomplishment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Lynn, would you like to, so Lynne Larson is Veda and my's partner in this effort to republish to publish these lost stories. Lynn is a longtime admirer of Maurine Whipple and the Giant Joshua. She's a graduate of Brigham Young University, has an MA in English from Idaho State University in Pocatello, is the author of several novels, short stories, articles, and essays of her own. So Lynn, what would you like to say about Maurine and this effort that we're doing? You're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, great.
First of all, I would like to say that this has been a wonderful experience for me, and I'm really glad to be a part of this. As Andrew has told you, I've been an admirer of Maurine and Maurine Whipple and of course the Joshua for a long time. I too have actually met. I actually met Maurine. When I first read The Giant Joshua many years ago, I was so impressed with it that my husband and I made a trip to St. George, as Curtis said that he did. We made a trip to St. George from our home in Idaho, especially to meet Maurine. We found her as well, and had a visit with her, and found her very willing to visit with us, and so I did get the opportunity of meeting her, a brief visit, and I certainly didn't know her as well as some of you did, but I do have that to remember, that I did meet her in person. I have a quick story to tell. I was talking to a writer who happens to live in my ward named James Goldberg. Maybe some of you might know who James Goldberg is, and he was telling me that a story about another writer named Carla Kelly, who writes historical fiction. She was giving a class here recently to a group of people to a group of fledgling writers, teaching them how to write historical fiction. And the first day of the class, when she was facing this group, she told them right up front, she said, "Now, I know that a lot of you are here to learn how to, I know that you're here to learn how to write the great Mormon novel. And I want to tell you right now that that's already been done. It was done back in 1941 by Maurine Whipple. And so you need to find yourself another goal. And so I thought that was very interesting that she should say that. It's always been kind of painful to me that some of us believe that little story, and yet so few Latter-day Saints have actually read Giant Joshua. And each time that I've read it, and I've read it several times, but I read it just recently because of this project, and each time that I read it, you know, several years go by in between the times that I read it, and each time I read it, I'm again amazed. And I'm amazed that so few Latter-day Saints who claim to love Mormon history and claim to love our ancestors and claim and celebrate each 24th of July and honor our ancestors and claim to love the pioneers, and yet they've never read the Giant Joshua. And I think that's a tragedy. I've really enjoyed, this project has been challenging, but I've really enjoyed working on it, and I just really take my hat off to Veda. The work that she and Lavina did, I just can't believe how wonderful that was. And I've kind of written down a little thing that I want to, my thoughts, and I'll just go ahead and read what I want to say here. In its July 2018 issue, the Ensign ran a story in its Latter-day Voices section called "The Good People of St. George." The brief piece was written by Claudio Gonzalez of Antofagasta, Chile, who recounted how as a boy he had seen a church movie showing President Lorenzo Snow praying for the people in southern Utah who were suffering from a severe drought. Lord, President Snow prayed, "Bless the good people of St. George." Brother Gonzalez said the phrase, "the good people of St. George," left a lasting impression on him as a youngster, and he always wanted to someday meet these faithful folks in faraway Utah, these people whose ancestors had earned a prophet's prayer, these people of St. George, whose goodness he could only imagine. Later, as a man with college-age sons, Claudio Gonzalez saw an opportunity to visit St. George while he was in Utah to drop off one of his boys at Brigham Young University. Even though St. George was not on the itinerary and 260 miles from Provo, Brother Gonzalez insisted on making the trip. "I want to see the good people of St. George," he said, remembering the phrase from the film he'd seen so many years before. The Gonzalez family made the journey, and Claudio Gonzalez finally got to fulfill his boyhood dream. He met the good people of St. George at last and discovered they were good people, but really not much different from many other good people he had known throughout his life. His story in the Ensign ended with a beautiful lesson about where good people are always found, whether they live in Utah or Chile or anywhere that the faithful reside and congregate across the world. Brother Gonzalez's story touched me when I first read it, and I certainly appreciated and agreed with his ultimate conclusion at the time that the good people of St. George are indeed found wherever faithful saints might gather. I still share that belief and love the idea of the St. George people in a boy's imagination being symbolic of good people everywhere. During the past 2 years, however, I've had reason to recall Claudio Gonzalez's Ensign story often as my work has taken me on a journey similar to his. I have traveled to southern Utah as well, conducting my own search for the good people of St. George, just as Brother Gonzalez did. But while my journey certainly included the 260-mile modern freeway from Provo that Brother Gonzalez traveled, it also took me back in time. to the day in the 1930s when a young woman named Maurine Whipple began taping handwritten pages to her bedroom wall, determined to organize her creative intuition into a story of her people. The masterpiece Whipple finally produced under extremely arduous circumstances became The Giant Joshua. After rereading it and other Whipple literature I gathered, I was convinced again of what I firmly believed when I first read Joshua more than 40 years ago. Maurine Whipple had given Mormonism an incomparable gift by simply introducing the rest of us to Erastus Snow, Lars Hansen, David White, the Yeast Lady, Brigham Young as we'd never known him, her unforgettable heroine, Clorinda McIntyre, and the whole heroic cavalcade of Dixie saints marching toward the deathless stars. And though I still believe in Claudio Gonzalez's conclusion about good people being everywhere, because of Maurine Whipple, I remain inspired by his first assumption. The good people of St. George were special all by themselves. My journey through time was actually made, of course, with my two colleagues here with us right now, Andrew Hall and Veda Hale. As we have compiled this collection of Whipple's finest work, short stories, essays, magazine articles, and novellas, and prepared to publish them with BCC Press under the title, A Craving for Beauty, the Lost Works of Maurine Whipple, I have gained a renewed admiration not only for Maurine, but for her land and people. And it all comes down to words well chosen and well put together. As a boy, Claudio Gonzalez became intrigued with the good people of St. George because of a church movie and Lorenzo Snow. I first became intrigued with the good people of St. George because of a book and Maurine Whipple. The words of each inspired both of us long after our first encounter. I have driven southward to St. George many times, but only in The Giant Joshua can I read these lines and imagine Chloe McIntyre entering the valley, a naive young girl of 17 in 1861. White and crimson, or black and yellow and blue, behind her and ahead and around her, spewed in fantastic violence in every shade and nuance. The colors of this unreal landscape glittered with such intensity that she closed her eyes, and for a moment her breath clung in her throat. She felt hemmed in with untamed, imponderable forces. This land was different from the gentle valleys of the north, as she imagined hell would be different from heaven. Shivering, she lifted her gaze beyond the valley to the west. There, continuing their mad dance, the ridges behind her joined hands with others, encircling tier on tier, concentric rings of color, vermilion, scarlet, maroon, or striped white and pink and gray. At the very vortex of this tangled network of canyons, there was a long black hill standing smoothly and soberly in the midst of the frenzy about it. Uncle Abijah said a similar black ridge faced it, although she could only see its crest from here, and that between the two black ridges lay the valley of sagebrush, where she was going to spend all the rest of her life, the valley that was already named, President Young had told them, the city of St. George. Always enthusiastic about my Mormon heritage and history, I had often been amazed by the power of good people who worked mightily together for a worthy cause. The stripling warriors, the 1847 pioneers, people who were valiant in their mission and in their spiritual resolve. But as a writer, I sometimes wondered, how could such devotion ever be sufficiently described? When I first read the following sentences from The Giant Joshua, I realized my question had been answered. The tabernacle in St. George was ever afterward a special place, and the temple shining in the desert, even decent homes came at a heavy price, was no longer just a place where Brigham Young once stood and pounded on his cane on the pulpit. The building arose from the barren ground like a great white wedding cake. It was 84 feet high to the top of the parapet, battlemented like an old castle. And there was a 135-foot tower on top of that. There were 12 Gothic buttresses along each side and 5 along each end. And there were, and the 3-tiered spire had panels to balance the line of buttresses. Inside, there were 2 spiral staircases winding upward the entire height of the building, 11 rooms in the basement and 1 main room above, with 8 smaller rooms around it. Long before the ceremonies were to start, a vast throng of people wandered around the block, squinted upward from the roadway, fell to the solid rock walls with their hands as if to bolster the evidence of their eyes. A temple that would cost $1 million. The world would have said it couldn't be done, and so they did it. Do you remember the angels in the sky when we dedicated the Nauvoo temple? Ketera Snow sat in her husband's coach and studied the chaste white walls through half-closed eyes. And the rushing sound, said Martha in an odd voice, the Spirit of God like a mighty rushing wind. I remember the tiled floors and the Bible verses painted on the plastered walls, and the font they said was a copy of the baptistry in King Solomon's temple, said Anna Marinda, but it wasn't as grand as this. No, sighed Aunt Ket, nothing could be as grand as this. To these lines, we can now add examples from essays like The Miracle on the Spillway, Whipple's dramatic tale of the day Brigham Jarvis and the men of Dixie finally conquered the Virgin River in 1885. That night, Brig Jarvis couldn't sleep, she begins, and from there the stunning victory is related in colorful detail. And she tells the story of how Brigham Jarvis figured out how to finally conquer the Virgin River that had flooded the land so many times. And if you know the giant Joshua, you know that story. And the details of that story are in our book, where in The Miracle of the Spillway. And she tells that story in vibrant detail. Maurine does. In her novella, The Arizona Strip, Whipple reminded the reader that there is a myth-breeding wilderness just south of St. George, where dark legends were muttered in the little towns along its perimeter. The strip was inhabited by characters with names like Slats Jacobs and Skunk Eye, a fellow with a Falstaffian belly, with friends in half a dozen states who would vie for the privilege of buying his overcoats and grub. No, Whipple did not limit her writing to the history of Mormon colonization. Real people appealed to her, no matter their stripe, and she made them vivid, colorful, and natural, wherever she found them, courageously infusing honesty rather than unblemished heroism in her writing. Whipple successfully published stories and essays in Collier's and the Saturday Evening Post, and worked hard to produce travel articles to promote Utah and her beloved Dixie. All of Whipple's work, published and unpublished, reflects her remarkable literary genius, even the small pieces that have little to do with geography. Her short story, Mormon Saga, reprinted in an upcoming issue of Dialogue, as Andrew said, and in our volume is an excellent example of that. An early critic called Clorie McIntyre the most appealing woman in modern fiction, and Avis Devoto, Bernard Devoto's wife, added, Whipple's characters appear in the round, a rough, hearty lot, rough of tongue, bursting with vitality. And that's why I just cringe when some people say that these are caricatures. They are not. Clorie herself recognized the strength of her people, and she felt a detached pity for the generations yet to come who couldn't plan and build a world. So even as I agree with Claudio Gonzalez that the good people of St. George are everywhere, I know that some of them still thrive in Maurine Whipple's Red Rock country, as they always have. The wonderful staff members of the Dixie State University, where I spent a great deal of time, they're still there, keeping Maurine's literary heritage protected, as they always have for future generations. But their long departed ancestors remain as well. Their voices echo on the canyon wind and linger in the rapidly changing world between Hurricane and Washington, Santa Clara and St. George. They would hardly recognize the place. Good Erastus Snow, Lars Hansen, the Use Lady, old Shadrach Gaunt, David White, Willie and Sheba, Maurine's beloved maternal grandmother, Cornelia McAllister, after whom Clory was modeled, and of course, Clory herself, the most appealing woman in modern fiction. Some of these folks linger only in spirit, some in the flesh through their descendants, but they live in Dixie still, on Whipple's eloquently crafted pages. Because of her, it's still possible to know them and forever claim them as our own. And that's why I'm so glad to be a part of this. And I plan for the rest of my time to push Maurine Whipple's works whenever I can, because I've written one for one reason, I've written myself or tried to, and I know how hard it is to do. I know how difficult it is to write even mundane things, even mundane and just passable stories. And to write a brilliant piece like she did, I just can't believe how she did it. And we should honor her and that gift that she gave us all we can. And I want to be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. That was great. And thank you so much for all the work that you've done on this project. Lynn has really been the key person to take this up and move it forward. And really did all the key work here. And I've been in Japan, I have not been able to go to the archives except for one time. I came and visited BYU and spent a week there. But Lynn's been the one going to St. George, going through the archives that Veda created in St. George and organized so wonderfully, Dixie State. So there's two archives. There's the BYU ones, which were taken in the 80s, where I forget his name, my family friend, went to her house in St. George and took all her stuff in 1985 or so and took them to BYU. And as Veda said, they were really not organized. Veda has organized them much better, but it's still quite an adventure going through them at BYU. And then Veda found other things as she was with Maurine, the famous stories found in the kitty litter, which became Dress for Christmas, and some of these other things. And then she took a lot of the best stuff from BYU, and when she finished her project, she donated them all to Dixie State University. And so they're all organized very well down there. Apparently, I haven't been down there. And that's there at the Library at Special Collections is also Maurine's desk where she did her writing. It was built for her by her father, Charlie. Helene Hansen, I understand you have a comment. Could you go ahead and make that? Could you introduce yourself too?
Sure. Am I unmuted?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes. Well, just thank you for the opportunity. I just was talking about in my little comment about how impressed I was with how masterful Whipple's style was, and her research, my goodness, about all the details of the clothing and the food and the glue making and what a scholar she was and how beautifully she wrote this. But this is mostly, in my opinion, a scathing indictment of polygamy. You get, quote after quote after quote after quote of how heart-wrenching this was, mostly through Clory's eyes, but through Willie, even Sheba, who's not very sympathetic, but it's hard on her too. And you hear this many times. I kept highlighting these passages about how painful it is for polygamy and how unnatural it is to the women. And I think this was done very, very nicely. You had the Nauvoo polygamy with Virginia Sorensen in A Little Lower Than the Angels, but this is even more heart-wrenching. And it was just so well done. And then not a flattering portrait of Brigham Young either. Makes him look like kind of a selfish scoundrel in many, many ways. All these sacrifices to build the temple, build the organ, build the tabernacle when they're struggling and practically starving. And not bringing the doctor in for Willie and letting her die a painful death. It just does not make him look good either. So I was saying how I can see why J. Reuben Clark did not like this book. Yeah, from an Orthodox point of view, I can see how it would offend. And that's all I had to say. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the polygamy, I mean, it's very much, she spent time with these older women who had been in polygamous relationships and people who were children of polygamists. Her parents, of course, were both children of polygamists. And I think, and she had this theory that generation was really wounded by it, the children, partly because the husbands were so split up, they weren't there and they weren't able to really financially take care of these families the way that they wanted to. And seemed to have been a lot of pain. These fathers who went off to Mexico and were gone, or during the raids, especially where all the families were split up. And I think she recorded that very well. She's, in some ways, she's the, discomfort, the comfortable. But, so to the Mormons, she's talked about the how terrible polygamy was. But then when the outsiders came and talked to her about it, I think she was someone who actually, defended a lot of the church and polygamy and things like that. So she was kind of this, of both sides. And I think showing the one family, the white family, which was a successful, happy polygamous family, was kind of a part of her effort to do that. But yes, certainly. I mean, the pain. I mean, the polygamy really destroys Chloe at the end, and that's a really key part of it. Thank you.
I think
yes,
Andrew.
Yes.
I think one thing that Maurine objected to was, and that she brought this out. There is a very, very good quote that Erastus Snow says, that although he loved and practically worshipped Brigham Young, he didn't feel that Brigham appreciated the gallantry of women. And I think I marked that in my book, that polygamy, that Erastus agreed with polygamy, but he didn't think that the great sacrifice of women or the gallantry of women was appreciated in their agreement to live it. And so I think that was one aspect. I think that was one thing that Maurine was trying to bring out, that as you say, she was trying to bring out the good side of polygamy with David and Powell's family, but she wanted the women that were involved in it to be more appreciated than they were with this great sacrifice. And so that was one aspect that she was trying to bring out, that okay, if the women are going to be sacrificed this way, if they're going to have to live this terrible thing, they at least ought to be appreciated for their gallantry in doing this.
And the portrayal of Brigham Young is very interesting. I mean, everything you said is right, Helene. But then, in some ways, there's a lot, she's very positive towards Brigham Young in other ways as well. I mean, he's a charming character in some ways. He's the one who, he goes to Chloe. Every time he visits Chloe and makes sure that he, holds her hand and talks to her for a while, and it really boosts her up. He visits every individual family and asks them how they're doing. And Eugene England, who wrote a biography of Brigham Young, he did a lot of work on him. He commented that in many ways he thought that this portrayal of Brigham Young got it more right than many biographers of Brigham Young had. Now, I mean, I don't know how. I mean, she read the discourses and I don't think she did real serious archival work, but she did she did a lot of work, and it's certainly is a fascinating portrayal. Eric Jepson, are you there? Would you like to say anything?
Yes, I am. I'd be delighted. I think one of the things that, as background, Kurt Vonnegut and his brother had this argument one time. His brother wanted to create art and have the mystery of not knowing who the artist was be the appealing thing, and people would just like the art because it was art. And Kurt Vonnegut responded that people never go for that. People want to know the artist. They want to have a story, a person to attach art to before it means everything it can mean. And I think one of the things we've lacked in having a canon of Mormon literature is we tend to forget our writers, and it makes it hard to understand the works if we don't understand the writers. I think Maurine can really help us fill this role. She's a fascinating person. I'm so glad these books are coming out. And I think that if you compare her with, say, someone from the generation before, like Nephi Anderson, the contrast between them is so important. When Maurine released this book, she knew people were going to be upset about it, and she went for it anyway. I have a letter in my possession from Emma-Ray McKay, and she talks about how disgusted she was with Maurine Whipple for writing the book, and how it was that the stories of polygamy were not for outsiders. And you get this sense of how fresh the wound still was back in the 50s. And I think that Maurine took this opportunity to put herself in a position to, and honestly, I think she was a little bit paranoid about how much people disliked her, but there's no question that she put herself in a position where she would be disliked, and she has become sort of a, this might be too strong a word, but she's sort of a martyr in a way for what excellent Mormon literature can be. And I think it's a really important role as we try to establish what our literature means to us as a people and as a culture. She is a really important figure and would be probably, even if the books were not as excellent as, or the book was not as excellent as it is. And I'm so excited to get your guys' collection when it comes out. It's gonna be a first week purchase for me for sure. And thank you so much for doing the work.
Thank you. Eric is our former president of the Association for Mormon Letters, past president, and he wrote a short story once called Maurine Whipple, age 16, takes a train north, which portrays Maurine meeting Nephi Anderson, who was one of the leading Mormon authors of the generation above her, and them talking about literature and religion. So it's a very interesting imagination of this possible meeting. So anyways, thank you, Eric.
Read that. Is it still in print? Where can we read that? The story.
I'll throw a link in the chat if you like.
Great.
We have there's something called the Mormon Lit Blitz that James Goldberg created, where at least once or twice a year, he does this call for short stories on Mormon themes. There's been about 9 or 10 of them so far, and just great stories have come out of that. And so that's one of them. So they're all available online, so you can.
Right.
Okay. Is there any other questions? We're at our time, but if anybody else has any questions or comments they'd like to make, go ahead and jump in now, including if any of our panelists, if they have anything they heard that they want to comment on. Curtis looks like you're.
Hi, if it's all right, I'd kind of like to make a plea for my own, for new stories. We are publishing in 2021 an anthology of mostly new Christmas stories by mostly Latter-day Saint authors. We're looking for new talent. So not all of us would qualify as new talent, but we also have some old talent in there too. So if anybody's interested, try to contact me, and I'd love to visit with you about possibly being a part of this new Christmas anthology, which will be called Spirit of the Season.
Great, thank you. So Curtis, I don't know if I mentioned, was the editor and then publisher of Aspen Press, which did some of the really the best Mormon literature in the early '90s, early mid '90s. Really heroic work there. So I'm very happy to see that coming back.
The new publishing company we have going is actually, we've resurrected Aspen Books. So we are Aspen Books again. So thank you.
Good. Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for participating. I recorded, but I forgot, and I started late, so I think I missed most of Carol Lynn's letter reading, which I'm very sorry about. I'm so sorry. My wife said, "Are you recording this?" And I'm like, "Oh, that's right." So I missed that, but I don't know. I'm sorry, Carol Lynn. But thank you so much for providing those with us. Thank you for being here.
Well, then just give me a quick plug on my brand new book, Finding Mother God.
Please.
That's all I want to say. Finding Mother God, Poems to Heal the World. Audiobook is also available, and that's all.
Well, let me ask you, Carolyn. So you wrote a book about polygamy. What do you think about okay, I'm not sure what to ask. Do you have anything to say about polygamy and the kind of things that Maurine, the kind of pain that Maurine's generation
I'm just sitting here feeling ashamed that it's been such a long time since I read The Giant Joshua. And I am absolutely going to hunt down my copy, or if I can't find it, I will get me a different one, because my sister and I are going to read that book right away. So I honor the tremendous work that all of you have done around this. And I'm sure that if Maurine is floating around, she's just thrilled to see good things come together in a warm and personable, appreciative way. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Hey, Curtis,
Yes.
if you look at the chat, Eric Jepson has a message for you there. So he's a fan of yours. So I wanted to make sure you guys.
Oh, great. Okay, I'll try to find out how to get a hold of him then, and we'll talk. By the way, about polygamy, when I read Giant Joshua, it did not hit me as an indictment against polygamy. I think one of the reasons why is I come from polygamous roots on all sides, all the way back. And I'd heard so many stories about the difficulties and also the divorces that had come during that time, that it was not news to me when I read this in the book. It was kind of like, it was old hat. What my great-grandmother said the reason she divorced her husband, was a polygamous relationship, was for the 3 Ps, pride, poverty, and polygamy. And so having been raised that way, I thought that what Maurine gave us was a reflection of reality. I think Maurine loved the truth, even when it hurt.
How about I end with this quote from the preface of the Giant Joshua, where she kind of explains what she's doing. So this is Maurine in October 1940. Perhaps there, she talks about how she's writing about these Mormon pioneers who have gone. They're gone now, and much of the gallant courage, the unquenchable faith of the old West goes with them. But the spirit that lived in their hearts, as American as Plymouth Rock, as enduring as the Rocky Mountains, that can never die. Perhaps, therefore, it is natural for our generation to deify them. Perhaps because of the abuse they suffered for over half a century, it is natural for us now to carry a chip on our shoulder toward the world, to lack a sense of humor regarding those who could not have survived without humor. But I believe we detract from their achievement when we paint them with too wide a brush. These people of whom I write are my people, and I love them. But I believe that what they did becomes even greater when we face the fact that they were human beings by birth and only saints by adoption.
She was great. That's just humbling to read that kind of quality from somebody that young.
Yeah.
All right.
And I think Maurine would have enjoyed the book of mine that you mentioned just a moment ago, The Ghost of Eternal Polygamy, Haunting the Hearts of Mormon Women and Men, in which I show all of these examples of how today Mormon women especially, and a lot of men, are in enormous pain because of the ongoing presence in their minds, in their marriages, in their ideas of heaven and of God, that polygamy is possibly waiting for them on the other side. I think Maurine would have liked that.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you so much, everybody, for participating. I loved hearing all your voices. I loved having this chance to celebrate Maurine. It's been a long time since she's been gone, but I'm so glad that her work is living on, and may it continue to do so. All right, everybody, have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Close it down. How come they didn't show your